Okay, I did a video on a cold air intake that I uploaded, and it's basically taking the factory air box, the lower part of it, out and just securing the filter so that the filter is secure and uses the factory box. Then I did a video on installing this cold air intake, which goes through the hole in the fender well down into where the air baffle is that quiets down the engine noise through the factory air box. I did not put that video up, and I actually didn't even install the filter the way it was recommended to be installed, which is running it down. I just ran it from here and over across here, and it worked fine. The air temperature did go up a little bit by keeping the filter so close to the engine. It's even a little bit lower with it just sitting here because it is most likely drawing air being forced through the baffle box up through the intake. My hope was to install it in properly eventually, which would either require removing the entire bumper, or I've seen a shorter way of doing it, which is remove the wheel and remove the splash guards in the wheel well to gain access to where you would remove the box or the baffles for the air intake, for the factory design air intake. Now, the big issue and the reason that I put this back on and took this off is that built in to this section of the box is, and it's actually about right here on this box, is and I'm not sure I'm using the right name for it. It's called an air straightener, and basically what it does is it takes the air that is coming in before it passes the mass airflow sensor, and it takes the turbulence out of the air flowing through the intake. And without that turbulence device, anti-turbulence device, or air straightener, I've seen a couple of different names for it, before the sensor, your sensor is not going to count your air as it comes into the engine. Now, I actually, with this setup, it's kind of ridiculous. I maintain all the engine's ability to produce power. Now, I know that ability was taken away when I put this on, because I got on I-75 and I hammered the throttle and I barely had 10 psi of boost. When I hammer the throttle and it's 90 degrees, I've seen as high as 17 psi boost with no computer modifications. Because of the temperature, probably. The average amount of boost I get on a mild day, even cool days, is 15 psi. With that air intake on there, I lost power. As a matter of fact, I lost a lot, because I noticed that even though it sounded great, it sounded like the engine was struggling to run because it wasn't getting accurate air count. And the funny thing is it didn't even throw an engine code. I ran it for a whole week, from last weekend till last night, because I took it off last night and put the other box on, and everything was really good. Now, one of the main indicators that I was having an issue, and this is my gauge set here, and I'm going to start the engine. One of the main indicators that there was an issue with my vehicle, with having that air intake on there, was the long-term fuel trim. And in just a second, when it's connected, and it is connected, and still stabilizing the connection, apparently. Come on. The communication is slow for some reason. But you can see that my long-term fuel trim is 2.3%. And it just changed. I was seeing a long-term fuel trim of minus 21%. You can see now the long-term fuel trim is 0, which is like supposedly the best. You don't want to see anything greater than minus 10% or greater than plus 10%. Either of those would be either rich or lean condition. If it's minus, it's a rich condition, and if it's plus, it's a lean condition. And your computer is trying to compensate for those conditions by adding or taking away fuel from the base pulse width of the injectors. Now, right now, that's just the best I've seen it since I ran the plain factory intake. And with this setup, I actually have the nice engine sound, and the engine is able to control the fuel system because the computer is able to control the engine's fuel system because it's counting all the air coming in. That part in the intake is apparently incredibly important for the engine to run properly. And I really think that it's not a new thing, because I've got older, I've seen older intakes with a honeycomb-like design thing right before the mass airflow sensors. So I know I'm kind of being long-winded on this, but a lot of people really it's a really popular thing to install a cold air intake, and they're going to cause it's going to cause an imbalance in the fuel system. It really is. I mean, I would not have believed it if I didn't do it myself. So I would say that if you want to do a cold air intake, you need to make sure you get a good intake. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad intake. This is a great intake. But I think one of the things you need to do is, I'm going to separate this real quick. Let me just set this down. Okay. And one of the things I think is absolutely going to be necessary is to make sure, you know, I kind of beat the hell out of this because I was trying to do something last night that I didn't do a video on, which was make an air straightener, but it didn't work. Is the distance between the sensor and the honeycomb thing, which you can buy, and I'll try to include that in this video on what it looks like, an image or something in the description box, or a link to where you can find it, should be the same as the factory air straightener. Okay. So however close the factory air straightener is, I can't show you on this because I've started it and I can't pull it apart, and I'm not going to take the filter out. It's about, I think it's about an inch or so. So if you put a air straightener in, you want to make sure that it is almost the same distance from the mass airflow sensor, which I say is about an inch or so on mine. Yours could be an inch, it could be 2 inches, depending on the engineered design of where the mass airflow sensor is. But I'm not saying this is a bad intake. It's a bad idea. And I'm not sure that this is going to apply or affect a non-turbocharged engine. like your other cruises, your 1.8 liter cruise engines, but it certainly affected the turbocharged engines, and it certainly dropped my boost pressure. And like I said, even with a factory intake, slightly modified, I've still seen boost pressures as high as 16 psi, maybe even 17 on really, really hot days, because the computer is compensating for the temperature and the lack of oxygen in higher temperature airs, or air rather. So if you're going to modify the intake, I guess one of the things to do is to make sure you check your car, how it's operating. So basically a baseline. You're going to need a baseline, and you should baseline your fuel trims, and if you have a turbo, you should baseline your boost pressures at various places. You know, I'd say maybe baseline them, you know, like a quick acceleration, a full throttle acceleration, and then just cruising around just to see where your boost pressures are. And your fuel trims, you should absolutely know. Like, I was lucky, I knew that there was something fishy, but I didn't think anything of it until I hammered the throttle and I just didn't have the power, and I didn't have the boost pressure. Then I started going through, reading and checking different things about cold air intakes and their negative effects on the engine, more than just the fact that you're sucking air all around the engine. Like, I've noticed a lot of people are not calling them cold air intakes, they're calling them hot cold air intakes, or hot air intakes, you know. And like I've tried to say, I've tried to tell people, it's like cold air intakes really should be remarketed as engine cool sounding devices, because really a lot of your factory air intake system, besides the baffle, isn't terribly restrictive. I mean, depending on what you're doing, the application is everything. If you are adding a lot of power, changing boost pressures, you definitely need to make sure you increase your airflow, but you have to make sure that you're getting the air counted. And the big point is, and I've gone around in circles here a little bit, is that air straightener or honeycomb that's in the factory air intake right before the mass airflow sensor needs to be there to take the air turbulence out, obviously, because I had a huge imbalance in my fuel, and my performance was definitely not there with the factory intake. Now I've driven all week and I gotta go get fuel, so I'm gonna have to end this.